Well, it's that time of the day where we talk business. Hello there. Thank you for joining us on the midweek edition of Your Business Nigeria. Here are the highlights and stories we're tracking at this time. Nigeria's FDI rises to $223.3 million in the first 5 months of the year as IATA projects $700 million loss in Africa's aviation sector over poor vaccination. Stocks gain as investors brace for U.S. inflation data. On our interview segment today, our conversation will start with Nigeria's power sector. Let's understand the issues around regulators taking over some distribution companies. I'm sure you've heard about that in recent times, as well as the pros and the cons of this development. What does this mean about the privatization process? We'll talk about that, and we have the right person joining us to analyze this in the first half of the show. On the other half, we'll shift our focus to Nigeria's economy. A lot of prospects and projections amid global headwinds. Let's also break that down and see if we need to reproject or re-strategize as we move on in 2022. Let's start with news making headlines across the world of business. In spite of the headwinds faced by most economies as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war, Nigeria was able to attract $223.3 million as foreign direct investments in the first 5 months of 2022, representing a 3.7% increase compared to the $215.3 million recorded in the corresponding period of the previous year. According to the latest report from the Central Bank of Nigeria, Nigeria's foreign direct investment has dwindled significantly, recently hitting a record low of $698.8 million in 2021, most of which are equities. The report also shows that FDIs declined by 7.5% compared to $241.5 million received in the reference period. Foreign direct investment is a form of inflow in which investors bring in their investments in an enterprise in another economy with the objective of gaining control of exerting significant influence over the management of the firm. Nigeria's crude oil production rose from 1.024 million barrels per day to 1.158 million barrels per day in the month of June 2022. Well, that's according to another report from the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, in its monthly oil market report for July 2022. We stated that higher future prices and strong fiscal crude market fundamentals drove the increase amid high crude demand from refiners and several supply disruptions. The report also shows that the country produced more crude oil in April this year as its output at the time was 1.219 million barrels per day, while crude oil production in May 2022 recorded 1.024 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, OPEC noted that it dedicated its July 2022 monthly oil market report to its late and immediate past Secretary General, Mr. Mohammed Sanusi Bakindo, who passed away on July 5, 2022 in his home country of Nigeria. International Air Transport Association says Africa's aviation sector could lose about $0.7 billion, that's about $700 million in 2022 due to a slow COVID-19 vaccination rate. IATA, in its financial performance report for the African aviation sector, stated that lower vaccination rates slowed Africa's air travel recovery, but some catching up could happen this year if governments work more closely with operators. According to the report, the capacity for May 2022 was up 78.5% and load factor climbed 16.4 percentage points to 68.4%, the lowest among regions. That association also notes that IATA that the COVID-19 pandemic has created so much uncertainty in the global aviation industry with a knee-jerk policy flip-flops, causing potential opportunities regulatory ramping up smooth activities of the sector. Well, let's get to our first topic of discuss today. The wind of restructuring exercise blowing across some of the electricity distribution companies over their exposure to bank loans and their attendant lack of capacity to settle their obligations may augur well for the power sector, which is currently performing below expectations. It will interest you to know that the federal government last week announced the commencement of a restructuring program for some of the discos with the takeover of Kano, Benin, and Kaduna electricity distribution companies by Fidelity Bank PLC, Afri-Exim Bank, Keystone Bank, and EcoBank PLC. Now, although the federal government says the restructuring and takeover of these 5 electricity distribution companies across the country by some banks in a move that might not be connected with their inability to meet up with the repayment of its debt obligations. Despite the huge investment in the power sector amid the incessant collapse of power grid, stakeholders are currently at loggerheads over the poor performance of these 11 distribution companies operating in the country and the defense of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Let's look at this critically. And I'm being joined from Abuja via Zoom by a former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, Mr. Sam Madi. Dr. Madi, thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, let's start very quickly. The federal government has actually backed this move of the takeover of these discos. But I will ask this way, is that the way to go? Does this not show that there are real issues with the privatization process of Nigeria's power sector?
Well, it does show that there are underlying crises that manifest from time to time. So 2 things here. One is that the takeover stepping by the banks is a function of both the poor performance of the discos themselves, as well as evidence of a larger distress. So if, for example, the discos were doing well, paying, servicing their market obligations, providing quality service to their customers, but have issues with their investors, with their financiers, issues around maybe repayment of loan and all that, it won't be much cause for alarm because as corporate entities, they are free. They have they can have crises, they have problems, squabbles with shareholders or with financiers. But what this underlying why this is dangerous is because this is not just around dispute around legality of corporate ownership or corporate management, but this is actually that these companies are not performing in the market. They're not performing their market obligations around trying to solve the problem of financing. They are paying for their supplies, whether raw material or power. And they're not also performing at a level of paying the shareholder, the financiers, the persons paying the financier. So it's a crisis of both the financial bankruptcy of this entity, but of course, their operational failure, because part of that financial bankruptcy is that they are not servicing their customers well and are not receiving revenue, not able to service both upstream and downstream obligations. So yes, you should be worried that this is 5 of them are out and down and going through restructuring. A couple of them really in that situation, maybe a exception of 1 or 2 that are strong, arguably strong in financial terms. Essentially, the crisis of this sector has not been solved by privatization. But somewhere one can argue that it has been made worse because the financial contagion to both the bank itself and the debt overhang that makes it less attractive for refinancing, as the case might be, are some of the problems that maybe we didn't have in this magnitude as we have now. So a story of failure in a sense. Some people can argue that at least we have the electricity market that is a lot more responsive to these signals rather than on that government. But if you put everything together, the energy, the investment, the finance, and the fact that government continues also to finance this sector with loans and all forms of public financing. Then the question is that is a story that maybe with all our best intentions and efforts, we have not really succeeded in the objective of this reform, which is primarily to make these entities commercially viable, to make them operationally efficient.
One thing that I keep hearing many times when we talk about the sector since privatization is the aggregate technical competence and commercial collection loss. That's the ATC&C, as it's called in the sector. And you see, issues always has to do with liquidity. Owing banks, discos can't meet up, investors not doing what is necessary. So how can we fund or stabilize, one way or the other, what kind of intervention can help us get our power sector, not 100%, but even if it's 50%, where it should be, Dr. Amadi?
I think two levels. One is financial. Okay, so with the banks coming in with such as stepping rights, arguably, some people argue that maybe it doesn't even trigger a managerial takeover at this point. Some argue that there are still legal issues to sort out. But we don't expect cases with the court. But the one good side could be that these banks will be in a better position, maybe to institute a better board and a stronger, more competent board and management. And so the idea, therefore, is they're coming in, maybe more frugality, you're able to block the leakages and the waste and the corruption that is in the system. And that means that maybe these entities can now better service their market obligations and have those savings to finance recovery of lost capacity and the network, and that overall improves the performance. The second level, so we can hope that this plus a possible CBN financial reengineering. Some have talked about a reset, some have talked about some other multiple ways in which the central bank and other institutions can really help the financial side of the market, whether by giving them a special dollar window, whatever it is. Now, those are financial engineers. But at the operational level, there's need to strengthen budget management, need to improve regulation, the rigor and the ability and efficacy of regulation is weak. Same with the efficacy of budget management and task in the sector. So, in the short term, I would prescribe a return of the special task force on power. Now, this is not socializing the operations again. It's rather that there are some weak points, there are some task owners, some people of obligation in this market who may have dropped the ball, who are slacking in their approach. So, for example, the handshake between church and disco, issues around maybe traditional failure arising from maybe lack of diligence in managing that entity. Same with the discourse. So in the short to medium term, you can optimize the available capacity, optimize the available technical capacity so that you have more on time than off time. You have more uptime than downtime. So that there will be less system collapse. The discourse will be out less times. They will be able to pick more load and be able to serve their customers a more stable power, which means more return on investment. Then in the more medium to long term, we might now talk about rethinking the national electoral power policy, sitting back and doing a diagnostic. I think there are many ways we're going wrong with that. Obviously, I think we rushed it. The design was faulty from hindsight. It doesn't mean that any of the actors had bad faith or that they were really trying to do something wrong. But again, it was done at a time and moment globally where there's so much fundamentalism around orthodox liberal economic reform. The notion that once the private sector comes in, everything gets sorted out. And we didn't think in terms of corporate governance, in terms of like Egypt now, they are planning for privatization, but they have a long period to increase capacity. Today, they can boast about 2,000 megawatts. The last 5 years, they got in about 20,000. So if we had strengthened corporate governance, strengthened commercialization in the sector, and maybe now thinking about privatizing a much more bankable, a financially regarded entity, may be better for us. So what we've got is that we've made mistakes, but it will take us a medium to long term to clean up those mistakes, redirect the reform, and benefit and move in a direction that is pragmatic and that shows a proper diagnosis and refitting of the pieces. But in the short to medium term, we need to improve project management quickly so that even with the small capacity we have, even without totally rearticulating the network, even without revamping the disco networks with more investment, you can optimize time available, the supply of power, and the time you are out will be less. The time you need to do repairs and all those failures will be less. So 2 levels. One is financial, help more access to capital if it's possible. That's why the tariff has been going up steadily, even though they increment in a small measure to make the market more attractive for investment. CBN can undertake some financial engineering, open up a special discount window for the power sector, who knows? But the operational side of it has to require better budget management on all the entities in the market in the short term, and the holistic review of the reform program is policy presumptions in the medium to long.
Now, I still want to stay with issues around tariff. Now, cost-reflective tariff is what is being touted many times, and the discourse will tell you that they are yet to get to that point. But with the current structure, can Nigeria actually institute this cost-reflective tariff? That is one. We also had the issue of willing buyer, willing seller at a time where some people were ready to pay more, they get more supply. All of these kind of initiatives, do you think give us a headway? Because obviously we still generate less than 4,500 megawatts for 200 million people. So where's the fix? Where's the matchup in all of this?
First, let's talk about this cost tariff. Like I said, it has no textbook tariff that is best for everything. You have to factor the variable. We are getting to a point where maybe the tariff become unaffordable, and therefore the incentive to bypass and of course go off grid might be high. So there's a limit with the socioeconomic conditions, a limit to how much you can push the tariff in the short term. So, for example, if the tariff is 28 naira per kilowatt hour in Lagos, in Ikeja, for example, you can't think about pushing it to 60 or 40 in an instant. It's just not doable with the socioeconomic profile. So the problem then is that we are mismatching recovery. Short, we make investment, you borrow money, and then you want to recover in the short term. The tariff structure that enable you to amortize your borrowing or your debt, assets depreciation over time will be like 20, 15 years. So this sector needs an influx, injection of real funding, not short money, because the idea of always focusing on tariff escalation is the idea that you want maybe in a year, within a year framework or 2 years, you want to equal cost and price, cost and recovery. So you invest X, in 1 year turnaround, you get back X. This is going to be you invest X today, then you invest S plus 1, S plus 2, S plus 3, S plus, or X minus 1, X minus 2, until you get to 15, where you recover everything, plus return on investment, other aspect of the return. So the point here is the tariff is increasing small. If you look at the idea of bandwidth, which the NEC introduced, so there's something called ABC. It's a way of allowing the discourse more leeway to make money. So they say, okay, you are now in band A, and you're going to have 20 hours of power, but you never get 20 hours of power. But the idea is to provide a reasonable excuse to charge some people higher, but they're going to get arguably more power, but they're not going to get as advertised by the discourse. So many things have been done in this market to help the discourse have better tariff. But then what we are seeing is that better tariff may not be the answer to this problem, because this answer to this problem is both not pricing alone, it's also the endemic inefficiency that you need much more financing, much more managerial competence, use of technology, and a better project management structure to deliver value in the short term so that you can ramp up tariff. Tariff is very tricky. If you take it too far, it begins to become negative in terms of willingness to pay, and the discourse themselves fight for those traffic, and that will increase the debt scenario for them and make it worse. So yes, I want us to get to tariffs that are cost reflective, but then it requires being careful what we do.
All right, before I let you go, are you also, would you agree to the fact that we need to start looking away or looking out of this grid, thinking outside the box at this moment? Because obviously the grid cannot satisfy us as Nigerians, and that's on one side. Then what do you think as we move towards an election year? What sort of economic agenda do you think should be on ground with reviving or revamping Nigeria's power sector?
First, I think we need to think about, supplementing this grid improving the grid as it is and supplementing it off-grid, mini-grid, and all forms of grid, and smart grid as well, because people talk about renewable energy. We are seeing some movement in that direction. We need clean energy, we need renewable energy, and we need a much more efficient energy mix. But again, let's not forget, we need a strong, robust, and efficient, fairly efficient, and of course sufficient national grid. We need a grid that's going to sustain industrial activity, commercial activity. We're not going to, go to small micro grids, and off-grid solutions. These are supplementary. So I would prioritize solving this crisis of the national grid. But as we do that, we have to also include off-grid and mini-grid and other forms of grid. Again, it requires some changes in the Power Sector Reform Act. Maybe increase threshold to have 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts, where nobody has the right to need any license, so that people can generate their own power, supplement their proposals, or even sell to the grid. Again, you also need to look at industrial clusters, whether you can bring them into some kind of off-grid or some kind of mini-grid, micro-grid to support, so that you can take advantage of the more regular supply of power to companies, to commercial activities, while you fix the national grid in a way that when the national grid is stable and maybe cheaper because of scale, some of these companies can shop into the national grid. So we need to do a lot about this. Again, back to the other question around, I guess, if I hear you well. So the national policy should be diversified energy mix, but don't lose sight of the need to build a reliable national grid. That's the way I would like to see. The second question you asked, I've forgotten the second aspect of the question. I think if you can remind me.
I was talking about political agenda for the power sector.
Sure. I get it. So I think, look, we need to do this at the same time. We need to de-emphasize politicizing the power sector. So let's not come back to the notion of going to do 30 megawatts, 5,000 megawatts, 400 megawatts. No. Let's not beat up any party on the power sector. What we want to hear candidates come out with studies around discovery of the problem. So let's not always talk about solution. Let's talk about diagnosis. So, for example, let's not hear more people talk about we're going to do 15,000 megawatts, we're going to crowd in renewable energy, we're going to create a diversified grid. Those are good, but we want to hear that candidates themselves are taking the pains to understand the problem, the diagnosis. This is what we found that we commissioned this study of experts, and this is what they're telling us. And so, based on this diagnosis, we are going to do X, Y, Z. So, in one breath, we should depoliticize the energy crisis in Nigeria. There's gone through too many waves of political campaigns. We had promises from the PDP government, now we had the APC government, and none of these governments have fixed this problem. So we should depoliticize. But at the same time, we should make it more of a discourse, more of problem solving, and political parties should now give us a rigorous research. What are they finding? What's the diagnosis? How are the experts picking up the malfunctioning in this sector? So that we will have to come to see a level of rigor and possible implementability, practicality of whatever they're going to say as part of their agenda for government when they win. So I would like to see more rigor. I would like to see political parties present reports of power sector and speak more to practical failings, speak more to rigorous search of understanding why it's not working and what will work, rather than sloganeering as usual around 14,000 megawatts, 20,000 megawatts, 14,000 megawatts, and such thoughts. They obscure and reduce the level of attention that we need to pay to the serious crisis of the constitutional framework of the power sector.
Interesting conversation. Dr. Sam Ahmad is the former chairman of the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Thank you so much for your time on Business Nigeria. We appreciate this.
Thank you very much.